This is Mrs. Doubtfire. It's a movie that should have never worked as well as it did. The premise of a man impersonating a housekeeper in order to sneak into his ex-wife's home, violate the terms of a custody agreement, and secretly spend more time with his kids is objectively terrifying. Yet Mrs. Doubtfire is still broadly looked back on as a beloved classic. And we have the talent of one man to thank for it.
Surprise!
Robin Williams played the main character, Daniel Hillard, with the same childlike whimsy that carried him through several of the biggest projects in his career. But that specific brand of playfulness was especially necessary for his role in Mrs. Doubtfire. It was a role which could have devolved into disturbing territory quite quickly. Take, for example, the prank call sequence. It's one of the funniest bits in the movie, but it could have gone really wrong without Williams' stellar performance to ground it.
Are your kids well behaved, or do they need like a few light slams every now and then?
The concept of a man obsessively calling his ex-wife and impersonating nanny prospects is creepy and obnoxious. Yet Williams made it fun to watch. His talents for improvisation and impressions made the whole thing far more charming than it has any right to be on paper. He really embodied the character of Mrs. Doubtfire through both his vocal talent and his general physicality under all the hair and makeup effects. But it wasn't just Mrs. Doubtfire who was soft and sweet. Remember that Williams essentially played two characters in this movie, and the character of Daniel held his own as an eager, amiable father figure. There's an early scene in Mrs. Doubtfire where Daniel is picking his children up from school. Williams' gentle energy is on full display here, and it's immediately clear to the audience just from the way he smiles that these children are everything to him. He is a safe and loving person in their lives. This was all intentional on the part of Williams and Columbus, the latter of which has specifically pointed to this scene as one of his favorite character moments in the film.
The smile on Robin's face when he first sees the kids says it all for me. These children are his life, his reason for being.
Altogether, the performance lent the movie a sort of heartwarming credibility. The story was believable and the character was likable largely because Robin Williams himself was believable and likable.
Yeah!
But his on-screen performance is only half the story. Williams' mere presence on set was enough to make the movie that much more charming. 5-year-old Mara Wilson, who plays the part of Daniel's youngest daughter Natalie, spends most of the aforementioned after-school scene in Williams' arms while he banters with the two older children. But there's an adorable moment between Daniel and Natalie where they hiss playfully at one another. It's a great illustration of how close they are as father and daughter, and it was entirely unscripted. Those little asides demonstrate just how comfortable these kids were with the way Williams presented himself both in front of the camera and just generally on set. But that trend didn't stop with the child performers. By nature, Robin seemed to provide a place for actors to open up and really play. Thankfully, Chris Columbus trusted him enough to help facilitate that environment too. As such, some of the most memorable moments in Mrs. Doubtfire are the product of improvisation.
Thank you. This is the only two-piece suit that I ever wear. Sorry, I don't have one. The tent maker died.
You sure now?
Oh, no, really. I think I would blind people with these white legs.
Improvisation on the part of Williams, yes, but especially on the part of the other actors playing off of Williams. Most of the dialogue between Daniel and his brother Frank is improv, as well as virtually everything that happens between Mrs. Doubtfire and the bus driver. And of course, the bit everyone remembers where Mrs. Doubtfire hides behind a mask of melting icing was entirely improvised by Robin Williams, while Anne Haney's Mrs. Sellner had to sit there as a comically stone-faced scene companion. It's a true statement to what kind of man Robin Williams was when he was able to not only steal a scene with improvised jokes, but step back and give other actors the freedom and support necessary to do the same. Those small moments and bits of dialogue from characters like Natalie, Frank, and Mrs. Sellner made the movie feel genuine. It reminded the audience that the secondary characters were more than just springboards for Williams' jokes. That additional bit of humanity helps to drive the emotional core of the movie home. The culmination of all of this comes in the form of a scene a little over halfway into the movie. The titular Mrs. Doubtfire and Daniel's ex-wife, Sally Field's Miranda Hillard, have a conversation in the family's kitchen. It starts out innocent enough before segueing into some of the most brilliant improv of the movie. Williams delivers several great jokes about Mrs. Doubtfire's late husband, and Sally Field plays off of him perfectly.
It was a drink that killed him.
How awful. He was an alcoholic.
No, he was hit by a Guinness truck.
All the while, Williams maintains the physicality of Mrs. Doubtfire with ease, allowing for only one intentional slip of the persona after a damning comment from Miranda.
Who needs a husband when I've got you?
Oh, surely you don't mean that, dear.
Well,
Oh, that's so sweet.
It's playful and fun in that way only Robin Williams could produce. But while the audience is laughing, the movie slips into genuine sincerity. They address why Miranda was unhappy in her marriage to Daniel, and for the first time, he understands that divorce is really the best option for the two of them.
I didn't like who I was when I was with him. I would turn into this horrible person. I didn't want my kids growing up with a mother like that.
You can see that Daniel is struggling to maintain Mrs. Doubtfire's pleasantly neutral expression, while he grapples with the reality that the woman he was married to used to cry herself to sleep at night. It's a heartbreaking and beautiful moment that Williams really hits the emotionality of. But it's cushioned by those improvised jokes that made the audience feel as comfortable in the scene as the actors felt with Robin on set. It made the scene, and indeed the whole movie, a joy to watch. And he is the reason for all of it. We may never see an actor like Robin Williams again. The man was truly one of a kind, and there is perhaps no better example of that fact than his role in this movie. With a different actor at the wheel, Mrs. Doubtfire could have come off as a hateful horror show. But the sheer talent and authentically delightful nature of Robin Williams made it into a classic fit for the whole family.